What is the IFB? Again, it's an acronym for Independent Fundamental Baptist. What do I mean King James only? What is that? Now, that is the belief that the only true version of the Bible, the only version of the Bible that is actually accurate and true, is the King James version of the Bible. Whether it was intended for it to happen this way or not, but the King James version only idea and philosophy kind of fortified, in my opinion, fortified the bubble and served that purpose, like I said, of insulating and isolating the people inside the movement from any other outside faithful Christian influence. Just because you believe or you're in a group that believes that the King James version is the only, that does not make you super Christians. God told me, He said, I didn't give you and allowed you to go through the experiences that you did so you could sit around on that information your entire life and not help anybody else. All right, so welcome to this episode of the Kingdom Reset podcast. And I've not made a full episode yet to fully explain what it is that I want to accomplish with the Kingdom Reset podcast. But basically it boils down to this. I think there are a lot of Christians, a lot of believers all across Western Christianity that are just feel like something's missing, like something's lost. They're not fulfilling their potential that God gave for them. God gave for them when He created them. You know, God has given every single one of us certain gifts, certain responsibilities, certain abilities that He wants us to use to further His kingdom. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions and bad mindsets and philosophies and even maybe some off-the-wall doctrine that is keeping Christians from being able to fulfill that kingdom purpose. So I've been planning and working on starting this podcast for a very long time. And I still remember when I was thinking about it and just the name Kingdom Reset kind of came to me. I had all these things I was very, very extremely excited about that I wanted to talk about, that I thought were going to be important for people to hear and understand so that they can accomplish more for God and expand His kingdom even further. But then as I was planning that, God kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, well, Mark, there's somewhere I want you to start first. And I've kind of with trepidation asked the Lord, okay, so what is that you're wanting me to start with? And He says, I want you to start with your background. And I'll tell you, I've been on a journey for about 20 years probably of coming out of some philosophies and mindsets and backgrounds so that I'm working towards and getting closer towards reaching the potential that God wants me to have for what He wants me to accomplish in this world with my life. But God told me He wants me to start with my background. And I want to tell you that this is not an easy conversation. These conversations, these first few episodes discussing my background is not going to be easy. And it's going to not be easy for several reasons, because of the background that I came out of. I still have a lot of people in there that I love and I pray for, people I still consider to be my friends. I still see them out in public and still enjoy talking with them and seeing them. And so I know this might upset some of them, but that's not my goal. That's not my purpose. And then it's also difficult because it's been almost 10 years since I came out of this background. And so it's a bit of a challenge for me to go back and revisit some of these things that I have from my past and from my background. So again, God tapped me on the shoulder and said, I want you to start here. And first I actually told Him no at first. No, I don't think that's one, but He wouldn't leave me alone about it. So here we go. So here's the big moment. What is the background that I came out of that I want to, or God wants me to start talking about today? Well, the background that I came from was one that is known, still around today, as the Independent Fundamental Baptist background and movement. And I've probably spent, thinking back since I've probably been around, I started getting around this when I was about 12 years old. And was involved with it till I was in my early 40s. So a long stint involved in this background. But first of all, I want to take a minute And again, I just want to reemphasize to my friends who are still in the movement, I am not trying to upset you. I'm not trying to create any anguish for you. I'm not trying to slander anybody or destroy anyone's ministry. I just want to talk about my experiences and the lessons that I think I've learned from them. So let me start out today. I want to talk about first of all, I want to talk about is what is the IFB? All right, what is IFB? IFB is the acronym that is most often referred to as, and again, it's an acronym for Independent Fundamental Baptist. Now, if you look at Christianity as a whole, what you'll see is there's a lot of different groups, even conservative. If you even just look at the conservative branches of Christianity here in America, there is a broad base of Christians that all across the board from all different stripes and backgrounds. And if you take the Independent Fundamental Baptist, it's like a tiny bubble inside of that greater spectrum of conservative Christianity that we have here in the West, in the United States, here in America, and even in some other countries. So it's a small bubble inside of that movement. And again, the views of the Independent Fundamental Baptist IFB, they kind of exist on a spectrum, okay? And there's a small minority of IFB churches that if you walked into them, I'm thinking of one right now, I believe it's in Las Vegas, Nevada, Independent Baptist Church. If you walked into them, it would feel much different than the average conservative church that you go into, whether it be Baptist, non-denominational, charismatic. It would kind of have the same feel. The worship would seem the same to a degree. The setup, the platform, the vibe would be very similar. All right. So, but that is a very, very, very small wing of the IFB, and probably the more mainstream IFB would kind of wish those churches would just scoot off and just call themselves something different. But that does exist. And then, let me back up here just a minute. All right, got ahead of myself. So, the middle of the spectrum in the IFB, of course, we just talked about those who are kind of the very rare ones that are much like other churches. But you got the middle of the spectrum, and that includes churches that would hold the more stringent practices, like the kind of music you listen to, not crazy over the top necessarily, the things that you wear and things like that. And in those churches, you might see the staff at the church holds to some of these practices, but not necessarily the lay people, because they're not really like in your face about it. So there are some that way. But much of what I went through in my background is the more extreme wing of it, and they're known for their near cultish control and their strict lifestyle standards, and that's the background that I came from. Again, I still have a lot of friends, a lot of people who are still involved in it, and if you're happy with that, that's fine. I'm not trying to dissuade you from that, but I'm just coming at it from the viewpoint of my experience. But I want to say this. There is a whole family of philosophies and mindsets that would hold most Christians back from realizing their full kingdom potential inside, particularly of that extreme IFB movement, because there's like a container of all of these errant ideas and philosophies and things that are out of proportion and out of context that would keep the average Christian from never coming anywhere close to what God wants them to accomplish with their life. So that's what the IFB is. So that being said, I got a lot of different topics, and I will cover them one by one as we go through the first few episodes of the podcast here. But so where do we start today? And I believe that there's one major belief in philosophy that is, in my opinion, it's the membrane that holds the whole bubble together. Everything about the extreme IFB is contained inside of this thing, and I'm going to explain why here. I'm going to explain what that belief is and why I believe it's part of what has perpetuated a lot of the craziness inside of some of those circles and some of those churches. So what am I talking about here? First one I'll talk about here, and this again, this one's deeply entrenched but it's this idea of King James Onlyism, sometimes known as KJVO. You hear and talk. One way you can recognize folks who hold to this belief is they don't call it the King James Version of the Bible. They call it the King James Bible because it's really the only one. So I want to talk about that, and I think again that's the membrane that holds the bubble together. So let's talk about that here for a few minutes. Now, just like there's a spectrum in the IFB, you've got some that are just a very few minority. They're just like any other church you walk into. You've got that mainstream, and then you've got the extreme. And there's even with the King James Version only idea that there's a spectrum. Now, first of all, think back of what do I mean King James only? What is that? Now, that is the belief that the only true version of the Bible, the only version of the Bible that is actually accurate and true and trustworthy is the King James Version of the Bible. It's the belief that it's the only one, and it's the belief that all others are perversions, and that Christians can get no true spiritual sustenance and no true spiritual growth apart from the King James Version of the Bible. It is a very, very strict belief, and I believe it's the membrane that holds everything together, and we'll explain that here more in just a minute. So there's a spectrum even with the King James Version only people, all right? So there are many independent Baptist churches that would refer to their position as King James preferred. They're not loud about it. They're not in your face about it. If you ask them, we just prefer to use the King James. And of course, if you're a visiting guest preacher and you come in there and want to preach, they would tell you to use the King James while you're there, all right? So that would be the light end of the King James only. And again, there are outside of independent Baptist, I know there are other groups and other denominations that hold this same idea and same philosophy. And I think a lot of the same principles and things I'm going to talk about here are still true. So you need to keep that in mind. So you've got the spectrum of those are just King James preferred. Then you got another group that would take a stronger stance, and they'll still fellowship with from a distance those who don't hold the position. They're not going to go do missionary work with you. They're not going to go serve at the homeless mission with you. They're not going to do these things because they're kind of, even though they're friendly and they hold that position very strongly, they'll be nice to you, but they're not going to cooperate with you in projects and inter-ministry projects and things like that. So, and again, this is just basic overviews here. Not everyone may exactly fit the mold that I'm explaining here, and I do realize that, and I'm kind of dealing with broad statements here. But like I said, the most stringent will claim that if you don't believe in the King James Version only, that the King James Version is the only true Bible for the English-speaking people, they will not cooperate or fellowship with you at all, and they will constantly come out and decry those who do not hold that position. If they were to find out that some independent Baptist preacher across town or in another state all of a sudden decided not to take that position, you would hear about it in many of these churches. So that is the spectrum that there is with the King James Version only position when it comes to Bible translation. So let's move along here. And, you know, like I said, I believe that the idea of the King James, KJVO, King James Version only, it is the membrane that holds the group together, all right? And there are several practices that are common amongst these groups that kind of ensure that bubble stays intact, all right? And kind of isolate their congregations and isolate their followers from the broader spectrum of mainstream conservative Christianity. And some of those beliefs that they'll tell you about, and I've heard, these are things I know I've heard, I've seen it firsthand, I even used to hold to some of these positions. But some of the things you might hear them say is don't read, study, or use as reference any other version but the KJV. This is what you'll hear in their leadership meetings. This is what you hear in their churches. This is what you hear from their pulpits. Don't read, study, or use as reference any version but the KJV. And they'll say, don't listen to preachers and teachers who aren't King James Version only. So guess what? Back in the day, when I started kind of pulling away from this idea, slowly, my mind of KJV only, that meant that the radio Bible preachers were out. Because that's where most of this is back early days of the internet, where a lot of podcasts and streaming and blogs and all this stuff were in the very early days. So don't listen to the radio preacher, but I have to tell you this. I did listen to the radio preacher, and I will say that that was one component that started kind of opening my eyes and helping me to see. All right, how this was not the dividing principle that we're making it out to be. So another thing, don't read Christian books by authors that aren't KJVO. I got it backwards, or KVJO, sorry. But now this one here, I can say this is something that they very much proclaim and preach and held to. In fact, let me just a little bit of my background. Not only as a teenager was I involved, my dad was a pastor, and we kind of followed the IFB model when I was a teenager. Then we got into more stringent and extreme versions of it when I went to Bible college, and then I served in one for 12 years in different capacities and things like that. And I still remember. And when I tell this story, if you're listening to this, you know who you are. I blame this all on you. So I got in contact with one of my old friends from the college that I went to, and he had gotten in really good with Phil Johnson, who is I'm not sure if he still is or not, but he was the director of John MacArthur's publishing ministry, Grace to You. And so this friend of mine from college knew that I had some questions. I was up in Connecticut serving at a church there. And he got a hold of Phil Johnson at Grace to You, that he kind of somewhat at that time had someone gotten a little bit of a relationship with. And he had Grace to You, he had Phil Johnson send me an entire box of John MacArthur books. Yes, John MacArthur books. And I started reading through those things. And of course, you know, he is not King James Version only. And although to this day I highly respect John MacArthur, there's still be things that I would disagree with or not see eye to eye with him on, not major fundamental things, but that was an extreme thing of helping unpack a lot of the mindsets and philosophies, and that was over 20 years ago. And I will say, after I got that box of books, I probably spent another 10 or 12 years inside the IFB movement. But let me just tell you, that's one of the reasons why I say I believe it's the membrane, it's the bubble that holds it all together. And of course, the last point here is don't closely fellowship with other Christians who aren't KJVO. So that's what holds the bubble together, in my opinion. This King James Version does an effective job of insulating and isolating the people inside of these churches and inside of that movement from being exposed to, in really regards, you know, IFB likes to pride itself on thinking that they're the closest to what the Bible has to say about ministry and about church and about faith and about Christian living. But I want to tell you, once you get outside of that, you can see that there's a lot of traditional Christian stuff that is more traditional than what they have, some of the things their people have come up with. You just be surprised. So that's why it's the whole thing. The standards, the views of pastoral leadership, the ideas about music, the ideas about living, the legalism, all these things are contained inside of this bubble known as a KJVO. So I'm going to go into just now, this next section may be a little bit more boring, but I'm going to kind of explain where they got this idea of King James Version onlyism. And this is kind of dense, so, you know, if you want to fast forward to a more practical part here in a little bit, feel free to do so. But let me ask you this question today. I don't know, where did our English Bibles come from? So if they believe that the King James Version of the Bible is the only true version of the Bible, where did that idea come from? Where was its genesis? Where did it come from? So as we know, the Bible was not originally written in English. In fact, the Old Testament was originally written mostly in Hebrew, with some sections like in Daniel that were written in Aramaic. And of course, the New Testament was written in Greek, a specific style of Greek known as Koine or Koine Greek, which was the kind of common language that the Greek speakers used back during the time of Christ and during the time of the apostles there in the first century. So again, we didn't start out with English with our Bible. It came from other languages, and just like anything, when you translate from one language to another, sometimes it's easy for things to get lost in translation. That's why a lot of people who study the Bible will use things like the Strong's Concordance to look up the meanings of Greek words and things like that, because the originals were written in a different language than what we speak, which of course is English. Now, of course, back during the early days of Christianity, in fact, just for writings in general, without the aid of technology, early copies of both the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, they were written out by hand. So instead of running down to as I used to say back, run down to your Xerox machine or your copier, or today your scanner, or take computers copying things and documents with your phone. Without that technology, they had to copy it by hand. And of course, when you copy these things by hand, there's always the possibility for copyist errors and mistakes and things like that, which is why when it comes to scholars who study Bible translations, things like that, that's why they like to look at across many different copies to determine what was the original reading of the Bible in that passage. Now, of course, the original documents that the Bible was written on, whether it be the Hebrew or whether it be the Greek, Hebrew/Arabic or Greek, we don't have any originals of that today. They perished to the halls of time millennia ago. We do not have them anymore. But there are some scholars, and I've heard this for years, that if you take and look at the number of copies that still survive today of the Bible, both of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible, if you look at all of those copies that are here today, we would have what I heard one scholar talk, we have an embarrassment of riches. So if there ever were an ancient document that had enough ammunition and enough copies and enough resources available of copies to determine what the Bible originally said, we have that and still more than that today. So we have the Bible is the what's one word I heard is the most accurate and clearly attested to set of documents in the history of mankind. There's nothing else from the ancient world that has survived the way the Bible has, and it's the copies in the original languages. So also, let's dig in a little bit deeper. So with the Old Testament, the system of copying that the Hebrew Old Testament went through, well, it was a painstaking process. You had these scribes, and for what I heard, if they would make an error on one of the scrolls, in some situations they would have to go burn the scroll and start all over again. So the scribes and the priests from the Old Testament, and even up into even in some into the more modern Hebrew era, you've had these people that are very painstakingly in the old world that were being very careful about these copies. So in fact, I've even heard that for the priests who would copy, the scribes who would copy the Old Testament, they would have to go and ritually cleanse themselves and purify themselves before they would write the name Jehovah or Yahweh in Hebrew on the scrolls that they were copying. So I will say there was, and this is a valuable tool for some, there was a Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint, and I will say that it does contain some altered readings from the Hebrew Old Testaments that we still have today. In fact, the name that's used for the predominant Hebrew text that's used for translation today is called the Masoretic text, and there's not a whole lot of controversy surrounding that because they have a lot more confidence in the copying of those Old Testament documents than what they do with a lot of the New Testament documents. However, I will say this, I think the Septuagint in one particular verse has an altered reading that will kind of completely change your viewpoint on the book of Genesis, starting from like chapter 6 and on, based on the translation of one verse in the book of Deuteronomy. So I think, in my opinion, the Septuagint probably contains some of the most accurate readings of the Old Testament, even compared to the Masoretic text. But what do I know? I am not a Hebrew scholar, and I'm just giving you an overview here of what some things you can know. All right. So now here we get to the major point of controversy. And when it comes to Bible translations, most of the controversy, most of the questions, and most of the discussion lies around the Greek copies that we have, that we use for Bible translation today. Now, again, I'm simplifying things here. I know this may not represent every family of documents that we have still today for Bible translation, but there are basically two major families of documents that represent the Greek copies of the New Testament. All right. Now, the first one we're going to talk about here is called the Alexandrian family of documents, and just give you some points about this, some things to know about the Alexandrian copies, the family of copies of the Greek that we have. It contains the oldest copies. I mean, some of these copies go back to about the 2nd century, I believe, early 2nd century. So some of these existing documents, they're not the originals, but they are very, very old. Also, the Alexandrian family contains the smallest number of copies. So not as many copies survived of the Alexandrian text that we still have available to us, that are still around today. And on the whole, also, if you count the number of words that are in the Alexandrian family of documents, you'll find that there are less words. So it's not as full and robust as what the other family of texts that we'll talk about here in a minute is. So that's the one line, the Alexandrian line of documents. So the other family is known as the Byzantine text. And just give you some data points, a fact sheet about these. First of all, the Byzantine family contains many more copies when you compare it to the Alexandrian family. There's a whole lot more to look through and compare and study with the Byzantine text. There's a lot more copies that are available. And the earliest copies of the Byzantine family are much newer than the Alexandrian. So there's not any copies in the Byzantine text that goes back to like the 2nd century. So this is where the controversy kind of centers on here. This is really where you start seeing differing opinions and things like that when it comes to what English Bible would you use, because what you do is they look at, okay, what family of documents was this translation of the New Testament translated from, and that is used as a determination by many to determine which Bible we should use. Now, all this stuff is legitimate. All of this stuff are tools that scholars and people who do biblical studies, and this even includes people who aren't believers who do biblical studies, this textual criticism tool of comparing and looking at things. It's not a bad word. It's not a bad thing. But this is where you start seeing the controversy coming in with these things here. All right. So here we go. Let's look at some of what the Alexandrian proponents have to say. So the proponents of the Alexandrian text say that the Alexandrian family is more accurate than the Byzantine family just by virtue of its age. I mean, we have copies, even the little pieces of parchment, that go all the way back to the 2nd century. So it's the oldest, so it has to be right? And the opponents of the Alexandrian say that just because it's older doesn't mean that's more accurate. And I'll give them that point. And I think there's some validity to that. But one of the main arguments that people who are that believe the Byzantine perspective, they say that the copies are older because nobody used them. You know, if you take a book that gets handed down generations in a family from father to son, or mother to daughter for generation after like the old family Bibles that people used to keep, they wear out over time because they get used, they get open, they get read, they get you know, oils from your skins on the pages and things. But if you take one that's sealed up in a box and stuck on a shelf somewhere, it's going to last a lot longer. So I'll give them that too. And also, many documents in the Alexandria family, they were stored in drier climates, which basically means that in a drier climate, the parchments and vellum, which was leather they wrote on, would last a whole lot longer in a dry climate than it would in the climates where the Byzantine text, family of texts, was stored over the centuries. So, and again, like I said, you know, they think the Byzantine texts say that's more accurate because it was copied and used more. They say there are no earlier copies because, like I said, the early ones just wore out. And also, but the opponents of the Byzantine text say that it has more. The Byzantine text has more words because the New Testament scribes and scholars, when they would copy things, they would sometimes write notes in the margin, and when they would write notes of clarification in the margin, eventually over a copy of time, you'd have another scholar come and say, "Now, did they add that because is this a note, or was that added because it was supposed to be, they forgot something and went back and just," you know how it is, sometimes you just put a little divot mark and add in what you want when you're writing something out. And when you're in handwritten copies, that could happen. So here's the thing, there are good points on both sides of this, Alexandrian and the Byzantine. But I will tell you that the King James only, the people who study it deeply, have latched on to the Byzantine text. And what should be this controversy between the two families of texts, and there are others, like the Catholics have the Vaticanus and some family and that type of thing that they have stored away. But here's the thing, these things that should just be, you know, collegiate discussions and disagreements and agree to disagree between scholars, KJVO folks who study have just latched onto it and have used this as ammunition to put forward their belief that the only true Bible is the King James Version of the Bible. So therein lies what the problem is these things that should not be points of major doctrinal difference or discussion, but it's made to be that. And again, it serves as that bubble that we talked about earlier. So that's enough. That's old stuff we're talking about there. So let's jump ahead to the IFB. And at least my background, my wing of it that I was involved with. How did that get introduced? How did that get introduced into the Independent Fundamental Baptist? I think the seeds of it were there, had been there for a long time, but I think there were specific things that happened that kind of just caused it to explode, and we'll look at that right now. And I'm going to name some names here, not in a mean or ugly kind of way, but I'm just as a factual thing. But let's fast forward to the 20th century, and I lived through this, so you're getting my perspective on what happened here, and a perspective that others share too. But the wing of the IFB that I was involved with, the most influential pastor in that movement was a pastor in Hammond, Indiana, whose name was Jack Hyles. Now, because of his influential voice, he held the King James Version only position. And because of his voice, and I think we'll see why here in a minute, or at least one of the factors, he I think converted a lot of people, took the seeds of it and brought it out to fruition, and a lot of people started converting to this idea that the King James is it, or you're not right with God. So the thing that's ironic about it is that in his early ministry, Jack Hyles did not hold that position. In fact, I've read it and seen it with my own eyes. He had a commentary that he wrote on the book of Revelation back in the 50s or 60s. And in that particular commentary, he was talking about how there were certain passages in Revelation that would be better translated as something different. So he didn't always hold that position. And in fact, some of his mentors I know also did not hold that position. One was, and some of you may know this name, John R. Rice. who was one of his mentors, someone that Jack Hyles looked up to, he wrote a book called Our God-Breathed Book, the Bible, and he even left the possibility for future translations and even more accurate translations in certain sections of that book. So it wasn't something, it was just ironic to me that Jack Hyles didn't always hold that position, and neither did his mentors. In fact, in some of my studies and things, I kind of got the idea that with John R. Rice, he of course, he died many years before Jack Hyles did. Many years before that, and I think Jack Hyles said, well, if he was older and more sharper in mind, then maybe he would see this King James only stuff the way that I see it now. So that was what kind of ironic about it. And I still remember this, one of his yearly pastors' conferences, and again, this is just from my recollection, and other people may have different memories of this event, but I think the core details that we'll talk about here actually happened. But in one of his years of the pastoral school, Hyles highlighted the book and actually invited her there to come to speak, which was kind of odd because a lot of times the IFB aren't too much about promoting women writing theological books and things like that. But she wrote a book a lady by the name of Gail Ripplinger, and she had written a book titled New Age Bible Versions. Now, I will tell you, when this book came out, in fact, at one point, I owned 2 copies of this book. And when this book came out, I tore through that over and over and over again and just took it all in. But many years later, when I started studying Bible translations and versions more, I look back at that book and remember some of the reasons. I want to tell you, looking back on it now, it was a collection of the wildest conspiracy theories about Bible translations you could possibly even imagine. I mean, a lot of it was just flat, unsubstantiated, and ridiculous. Now, I'll tell you, once he highlighted this woman in her book, like I said, from that point, at least in my recollection, the stringent KJV only movement just exploded in the IFB. It was everywhere. Now, here's how far some of them took. Hyles wrote this in the book and said this in sermons himself, that if when you got saved, if somebody used any other version of the Bible other than the King James version of the Bible, then you weren't really saved, and you need to make sure of your salvation. You need to rededicate your life to Christ, and I don't know, you might even need to get baptized again. Because they counted them baptisms, that's for sure. So it was just, that's what he said. Now, I will say this in all fairness, and I'd seen some indications of this, but I think he may have walked that belief back in some of his later years, because that was even kind of stringent for some of the KJVO folks. Saying, all right, Dr. Hyles, I think you're taking it, well, loosely, Dr. Hyles, I think you're taking it too far. But I think he may have walked that belief back in his later years. But just in the extreme independent fundamental Baptist movement that I was involved with, that was the things that, from my perspective, that I saw take place. And of course, there were plenty of other controversies that we can talk about later. But that was one that came up during that time. So let's get back here. I want to get back to my thoughts about the IFB bubble. And this is probably an idea that I came up with probably I'd say about 13, 14 years ago. But it is a bubble. And because of the fact, whether it was intended for it to happen this way or not, but the King James Version only idea and philosophy kind of fortified, in my opinion, the bubble and served that purpose, like I said earlier, of insulating and isolating the people inside the movement from any other outside faithful Christian influence whatsoever. So, from what I can see, many of the errant theology and practices of the IFB, particularly in the extreme versions of it, they would never have been able to take and hold in people's minds if the people in the pews had been encouraged to access information outside of their group. Now, just think about this, all right? The Apostle Paul, he talked about in the book, I think it's the book of Acts, a group called the Bereans. And the Bible tells us that those Bereans were more noble than the believers in some other cities. And here's the reason why, because it said they took what Paul said, the Apostle Paul said, and they went outside of their teacher, and they would go outside to other sources, and they would search the scriptures for themselves to see if what he was telling them was the truth. And it's the same thing with this thing about the King James Version only. Here's the thing about it. I have no problem with somebody. In fact, I don't have a problem with anybody, really. But if somebody, and they want to read the King James Version of the Bible and say, this is what I believe this is it, this is the one and the only, I'm sticking to this, then God bless you. You can read that King James Bible, and you can get in there, and you can grow in your faith, and you can do some things. But when you start taking that and using it to fortify a bunch of other things and to isolate yourself and others from the influence of any other Christians, then that's when it becomes a problem. That's when it becomes a problem. And I think that's what we really need, what really needs to be addressed. Now, we've talked about a lot of stuff today. And I want to talk about, what should you do with this information? What should you do with it? Well, let's talk about that. What should you do with this information? I think there's two groups of people that might be watching this. Well, probably three, and I'll add them in myself here in a minute, even though it's not my notes. Like I said, I still have friends that are in the movement, are in the churches and things like that. I love them. I consider them my friends. And again, I'm not trying to upset anyone, but there are some people who are inside, still in the churches that hold this King James Version only position, that are struggling with it, and they're still there. You've got a second group of those who have long left IFB, and they're just struggling with the mindsets. When you see that different version, you go attend a different church now, and you see that different version of the Bible pop up on the screen there, it still may give you a little bit of pause and maybe cause your heart to palpitate a little bit. And I think there's a third group, maybe I almost say 3 and 4. There's a third group of people who maybe are in different denominations or different backgrounds that aren't IFB that hold this position. This applies to you too. And then you've got some of you just have no idea what I'm talking about, and are just probably sitting back there just amazed at the fact that there are people who hold this type of an opinion about this particular issue. So what should you do? Now, if you're still in the IFB and you're struggling with this King James Version only issue, there's some lies that you might have been told, that you might have heard, or may have you just lies that were conclusions you drew from things that were said. But I like to go with don't believe these following lies about people who don't hold the position. Don't believe the lie number 1 that people who don't hold the KJVO position are ignorant. I want to tell you something I found out, is that there are people outside the King James Version only mindset and belief that are a whole lot smarter than what I was and knew a whole lot more about the Bible than what I did when I believed that particular, the King James Version only belief personally. So it's not out of ignorance. I used to think, well, people, if they knew, no, the people who study it and the people who are the leaders, they know. And they're not ignorant. And they have chosen not to have that belief for whatever the reason may be. Second lie, don't believe people. Here's a lie, don't believe that people who do not hold to KJV are better than those who don't. Just because you believe, or you're in a group that believes that the King James Version is the only, that does not make you super Christians. That doesn't make you impervious from needing the influence of outside Christian groups other than just the one that you're in. Another lie not to believe. Don't believe that those who don't hold to KJVO don't love the Lord as much as those who do. And like I said, having been out of the IFB, the extreme version, for almost 10 years now, most Christians that I've come in contact with, they love the Lord just as much. They want to serve the Lord just as much. They want to do good for their communities, and they want to reach people with the gospel, and they want to expand the kingdom just as much as those who do hold that King James only. And listen, there's another lie to believe. Don't believe that it's disloyalty or disrespect to ask questions. If there's one thing that I would change about my background and my experience, it would be this. Respectfully and lovingly ask questions. Even if you know the response that you're going to get is going to be negative just because you asked a question. If you have there's nothing wrong with asking questions to your leadership about this King James Version position if you're in a church that holds to that. And again, it should be done in love. It should be done in respect. So don't believe those lies. Don't believe the lies that a lot of times are even said from pulpits or in big closed door meetings or implied even, or conclusions you drew. Don't believe it. And then the next people I want to talk to here are those who left and are still struggling. In fact, some of these might help those who are still in there. Number one, don't be intimidated by folks who hold that are IFB, that hold the King James Version only position. It's real easy to be intimidated by it and back away and see them in public or online and say, well, I'm not commenting on their post and I'm not going to say hello to them. I'll stay away from them. No. If that's the, and again, let me make a caveat here, because I know I got people who listen who were subjected to criminal activities. That's not what I'm talking about. All right, that's not what I'm talking about. But for those of you who just are friends with people, don't be intimidated by it. Be kind and be loving. And do that, all right? Second thing I'll tell you to do, and this is going to ruffle some feathers probably, but even if you're still sitting in an IFB church or if you just recently left, take a year and read through the whole Bible in a different translation, side by side with the KJV. I'm going to give a personal testimony here. I'm telling on myself, I guess. About 12 years ago, now I will tell you, the seeds for me getting out of the King James only version only was 20 years ago when I was still serving in a church in Connecticut. I started purposely going outside of the group and getting information from other sources. I did. I'm guilty. If that's something to be guilty about, which it's not. But about 10 years ago, I finally reached the point and said, you know what, I'm going to sit down. And I picked the ESV because it was the popular one at the time. I said, I'm going to use my Bible app and I'm going to read through the entire Bible in the ESV. And what I would do is as I would go through, and the King James I read dozens and dozens of times prior to this. All right, so having read the Bible that much in the King James, I was very familiar with what the King James had to say. And as I was reading through the ESV, if I'd come across verses, I said, that seems to say something different than what the King James that I'm used to says. So, now I'll be honest with you, when I quote Bible verses today, the King James is still what flies out of my mouth most of the time. And I've read enough of their translations that I'll add an addendum to that when I do sometimes. And I'd go through and I'd analyze those things. Now, there were some like, I think the ESV got it wrong that time. But 99% of the time, the things that I thought, well, that doesn't sound right, the ESV was just making the concepts there clearer in modern English than what the King James did. I actually learned things about the Christian life that I did not know prior to reading through the ESV. All right? And this is while I was still sitting in an IFB church. But again, I spent years exposing myself to stuff outside of the King James Version only mindset. Years. So do that. Take a year and pick up NASB. Some people like that. The CSB. There's so many other ones. Some of them, and I will tell you this, not all Bible translations are made the same. Some of them are paraphrases, and you've got to just realize what they are and take them for that. So, but get a good solid copy. The New American Standard, the ESV, the Holman Standard, some of the other ones. Read through it. Just read it. I know you may feel fear and trembling as you do it, but let me tell you something. There's things God wants you to learn on the other side of that. Another thing I'd say do is educate yourself on the faithfulness of many other English translations. Like I said a minute ago, not all English translations of the Bible are the same. Some of them are really good, and some of them are really not. And you need, rather than just having your pastor spoon feed you and tell you, read this version, do some research. As a Christian, do some research. In fact, I may do an episode on educating on some of these deeper in the future. And the last thing I'll say this, and for those even who are in it and those who are come out of it and are still struggling with it, look at the fruit of faithful Christians who aren't King James Version only. It may shock you. When I say it may shock you, I'm like, oh, how wicked they are. No, I'm talking about in a good way. It may shock you to see how fruitful some of these Christians are. And again, this podcast is not going to be all just about Independent Fundamental Baptist. In fact, it wasn't my starting point of choice. It's where the Lord led me to start. But seeing that as my background, there are a lot of things that I had to work through, including this issue of King James Version only, that I had to work through for many, many, many years. And for all those many years, a lot of times I didn't have the benefit of people that I knew personally to go out and converse with these things. I mean, everybody was afraid to talk about it, right? And if it did happen, it was in hush-hush corners away from the main thing, so you didn't become a sermon illustration on Sunday night. But listen, there's a lot of mindset. We're going to work through these, and it may take me the first, 10 episodes or stuff to work through the information here. Like I said, I don't want to stay here forever. I got other things I want to go after, other parts about, other Christian groups about that I think that may be holding people back. Not as critical or maybe as stringent as some of this IFB stuff, but we will get to some of those. So listen, if you're Independent Fundamental Baptist and you're in a group that holds that King James Version only, please take to heart what I said. I welcome anybody who disagrees with what I'm saying. You can disagree with it, and I'll still love you. It doesn't bother me. And like I said, I'm not trying to upset anyone. I'm not. I'm just giving my experiences. Part of the reason why when I was praying about this, God told me, He said, I didn't give you and allowed you to go through the experiences that you did so you could sit around on that information your entire life and not help anybody else. So in obedience to the Lord, and some people say, well, that's not obedience to the Lord because you're wrong. Well, I've got to walk out my Christian life between me and Him. But listen, think about these things. Take them to heart. And again, my goal is for everyone who listens to this to work through the things that are holding you back from reaching your full kingdom influence. And once you get to reset those things, reprogram yourself with the truth, with what the Christian life is supposed to be about, what your walk with God's supposed to be like, what your service and work for the Lord is supposed to be like, and go after that with everything that you have. So we'll see you in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this. If you got any questions, put them in the comments. Please be respectful. That's all I ask. If you have ideas of things or finer points of this you want to ask about, feel free to ask about them there, and we'll try to get to those in some future episodes. So, signing off, this is Mark Gasson with the Kingdom Reset Podcast, and we'll see you next time.